it has to be lots and lots of little T talks that feel much more informal and feel there's like no pressure around this. It's like, to say, like you can have conversations throughout the day or throughout, the weeks.
Hey, sweet mama. Welcome back to another episode of Mama Mindset. As always, I'm your host and creator, Amy Cawthron. Thank you so much for joining me today. And boy, howdy, do I have an absolutely incredible guest to introduce you today. Sam Tielemans is my phenomenal guest that we have on the podcast today. He's my second male guest, and I couldn't be more excited to introduce you to him. He's a licensed marriage and family therapist, and today's topic is a totally taboo topic. I'm going to be really honest and tell you I was a little bit nervous to have this conversation with him because I wasn't sure what questions to ask. I wasn't sure which direction to take this, but I knew that this was a topic that I wanted to discuss. I just wasn't sure how to go about it. And the beautiful thing about this conversation is I told Sam that. I was very honest. I told him, you are a wealth of knowledge. You're an expert in this area, and I'm not sure where to go. I'm not sure what questions to ask you. So we're just going to see where this goes. And I'm just going to come at it from like a genuinely interested, curious standpoint. And what is the topic? What the heck is this taboo topic that even Amy, even I was a little nervous to have a conversation about and was almost at a loss for words in the beginning before we really dove into it. And it's pornography. It's healing and struggling with pornography addiction within your marriage. We talk about what is pornography. We dive into the definition of pornography. We talk about how to approach this conversation with your spouse. We approach this from an addiction standpoint. And what is an addiction? Why is this happening? We talk about childhood traumas. We talk about the ways we can heal from this, ways we can heal from this together, healthy ways to talk about it, unhealthy ways to talk about it. When does this happen for most people? Is this common? Is this uncommon? Why is this happening? How do we prevent this? We dive a little bit into the parenting aspect of this in protecting our children. However, I do want to make it very clear that this conversation is not about parenting and protecting our children from pornography. This conversation is how we heal from it, how we approach it, and how this is impacting and affecting our marriages. So grab a cozy beverage, be brave, be bold, because all of us can learn from this conversation. And I want you to know how amazing Sam is at presenting this topic, how comfortable he makes us all feel in this conversation. So I think in fact, I know that you're going to gain a lot of information from this and a lot of insight to a topic that nobody is talking about. So grab a cozy beverage and join me in this conversational journey with Sam. Hi, Sam. Welcome to the show.
Hi there. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yes, absolutely. You are only my second male guest on the Mama Mindset podcast. So welcome.
That's great. Thank you very much. I have tremendous respect for the work that you're doing because I honestly think that motherhood is like the most important job. So I'm really happy to be here and serve in any way that I can.
Thank you. That means a lot. That means so much coming from you. I really appreciate you saying that. And I just want to give a little background too on how we got connected for my listeners. Megan Caston, who runs Marriage 365, emailed me and she introduced us. And I was immediately like, this is going to be an amazing conversation. Absolutely. So I'm grateful. Shout out to Megan for connecting us because she just knew we would be a good fit. So I'm excited to have this conversation. And just for the listeners, it is probably going to be a heavy conversation. So I just want people to understand that. But I think we all have something to learn from this. And I think, Sam, like you and I were talking before we started recording, that this is something that impacts almost everybody in some capacity. So I just think it's important to be open-minded and to listen and try and learn something. So why don't you take a second and introduce yourself and your background and how you got to be in this field?
Sure. Yeah. So, like you mentioned, my name is Sam Tielemans. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I specialize in working with couples, specifically helping couples heal after the impact of pornography or infidelity and rebuilding trust together after the damage that causes. And the way that I got started in this, I remember I was in grad school speaking with a friend of mine, and he was telling me, he opened up and shared his struggle with pornography. And he said that he's doing everything he possibly can and he still cannot overcome it. And I remember sitting there listening to him thinking like, this has got to be an issue that a lot of people are struggling with. And I remember I had the thought, this is something I should learn how to treat. And so from that day, he started to become my mentor because he knew so much. He'd been doing this for like 7 years. He knew like so much, but he still had a hard time actually overcoming it.
Mm-hmm.
And so through the process of learning and then going to trainings and reading and supervision, like just years of work and effort, I feel like this is the place where I'm supposed to be, because I think it just affects so many families. And like I mentioned earlier, I honestly do have a tremendous amount of respect for moms and dads too, but parenting and the relationships in our families are so important. And this is an issue that divides many, many families. There's some research that talks about around 50% of divorces are a result of pornography use
Oh,
and
wow.
the effects of betrayal and the hurt that causes. So
Mm-hmm.
it deeply affects the people that I work with. And I know that it affects even more people who aren't talking about it,
Mm-hmm.
just because it's a sensitive topic. But one of the first things that's important for people to do is recognize that you're not alone. This is something that, it's so accessible and available that it affects most people. And so there's a way forward. There's a way to have conversations about it. There's a way to heal from the pain that it causes. And there's a way for people who are struggling to actually overcome it. And so, yeah, it's been awesome to see the progress that people make and the changes in the family that
Mm-hmm.
occur when they just get the direction and the tools that they need.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's been a privilege to be able to serve people who are struggling. And again, I want to share in any way that I can to help people understand that it's possible to move forward and heal.
Mm-hmm. I love that. So would you say the majority of your clients or your patients coming in are females, or are they couples, or is it both?
So good question. Yep. So I mostly work with couples. Well, the people who
Mm-hmm.
approach me are mostly couples, where the husband's struggling with an addiction or a habit on some level,
Mm-hmm.
and it's affected the relationship and the trust. And so they want to not only rid the relationship of the pornography, but then heal the damage that it caused. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, most people are couples.
Mm-hmm. So if you're okay, so if you're a mom listening, okay, let me back up because there's so much that we could dive into. Okay. I'm
Sure.
like,
Yeah.
which direction do I want to go in? Because there's so many questions. So can you define for us what you mean by pornography? Let's go with that, because I think for people there's so many values out there and there's so many belief systems out there. So maybe it's different for somebody else. What constitutes pornography and what doesn't?
That's a great question. And it's so difficult because everybody does have their own definition, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's what one person says is pornography. Another person might say, well, no, that's art. It's a painting, right?
Right.
So it's difficult to one of in the most broad terms, it's sexually explicit material designed to arouse somebody.
Mm.
So
Oh,
on the highest level,
like commercials that are on the freaking TV right now.
it's crazy, right? The stuff
Yeah.
that's allowed now. But yeah. So in the broadest of terms,
Okay.
it would be that.
Yeah. Okay. So it is so broad. I mean, I'm just sitting here thinking like there's stuff that the kids have watched on football,
Yes.
halftime shows that I'm like,
Right.
what just happened? What just
Yes.
happened? So going into that, how do we protect ourselves from that a little bit? Or how do we create some boundaries around that when it is so accessible and everywhere? Every time you turn the corner, I mean, there's like billboards on the side of buses, right? Like it's everywhere.
Yep. And I live in Las Vegas, so it literally is everywhere. There's billboards and buses and taxis, and so you can't get away from it. I was having a conversation with somebody recently. I said that it used to be that you had to go out of your way to find it.
Mm-hmm.
Now you have to go out of your way to not run into it
Mm-hmm.
because it's like so prevalent. And so in terms of protecting a family or a relationship or a marriage, I think one of the most important things to do is start to have conversations about it, because so often this is something that isn't talked about. Or if sometimes wives or women will bring it up to their husbands or their partners and say, hey, I saw this, or is this something that you struggle with? I had a conversation with my friend and her husband's struggling with this. Is this something that you struggle with? So often there is reservations to talk about it, because many men know the effect of like, okay, she's probably not going to like this, or I don't want to hurt her,
Mm-hmm.
so I don't want to fully disclose. I think so many people struggle with this because it's a very difficult subject to talk about. But I think one of the most important things to do is to talk about it, as difficult as it is, because
Mm-hmm.
once you do, then you can start to say, this is comfortable for me, this isn't comfortable for me. How do we navigate this? What does this mean to you? If you are watching this, why? Help me understand what's going on. You can open up the door by having that initial talk of, if this is something that they're struggling with, to then figure out your comfort level with it and how you guys can approach it together.
Mm-hmm. So how do you approach that conversation? If you've never had this conversation before, how do you approach that? Is there like a place? Is there a time? Is there a way? Is there a mindset? Like, are there some tips that you have to, I mean, you don't just be like, hey, are you watching porn? How's that going for you? Like, you
Right,
can't really,
right,
you want to, and you also don't want to come at it like accusatory. You don't want to
right,
come at it and then be shocked with the answer and then get mad. So how do you approach
right.
that conversation?
No, I think I agree. I think the timing is important, and I think
Mm-hmm.
the approach is important. And if it's done in a way that is open to conversation, that's going to be the best way.
Mm-hmm.
Because if there is an accusation, or if somebody were to say, if I ever catch you, I remember working with a client one time where the wife said, if I ever catch, let me actually take one more step back. The reason why I brought up this, sometimes women will have conversations, find out that another woman's husband's struggling. This happened to a client of mine where the wife came home and said, hey, so and so's family, I guess everybody's open, they're all friends. Hey, there's a struggle with one of my friends, didn't disclose who it was, but there's a struggle with my friend's husband. If I ever catch you watching this, then I'm going to divorce you. And he had secretly been struggling with an addiction. So when he hears, I'm going to leave you if you struggle with this, instantly he's now in the spot of saying to himself, I can never tell her,
Mm-hmm.
because if I do, she's going to leave me. And that's the last thing that I want. So I'm stuck, because number one, I feel like this is a problem for me too. Number two, now I can't open up and talk about this with you because I don't want to lose everything.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think opening it up in a way where you can have a conversation, and if women are wondering if their husband's struggling with this, I think you can ask. I think you can say, hey, this is something that I'm thinking about, or as I watch TV, I see all these images, and it affects me in XYZ type of a way. Is this something that you struggle with? Like, have you had struggles in the past with pornography, or is this something that you view? I just want to understand if this is something that's happening in your life. And I'd love to talk about, if that's true, I'd love to talk about more of like, why, like, is this important to you? Because this is how I feel about it. And I'd love us to be able to come together and talk about that. So I
Mm-hmm.
think in that kind of an open way, you're going to get a better response than if you were to say, if this is a problem, then, I'm going to leave. Right.
Right. Right. So just approaching it much more open, maybe with like a healing mindset of, okay, I'm prepared for the answer. I'm curious. I'm not going to like the answer, but I'm genuinely asking because I want to get to the bottom of it. And then from here, we can heal and kind of move forward. So maybe it's just your mindset. Instead of going into it with an accusation or an accusatory attitude, maybe it's just the mindset of, I'm genuinely curious and let's see where we can go from here, kind of thing.
I
Uh,
like that a lot.
yeah. Okay. So I'm sitting here thinking about everything that there is in like the news and just all of the different forms of advertising and everything that's thrown at us constantly all day, right? Through social media. Like you said, you're in Vegas. So like everywhere you turn on the
Yes.
corner. Um, as a female, I feel that women have been so overly sexualized in the last 50 years compared to what it was, that now there's this feeling of inadequacy constantly. And I'm just speaking from a female perspective. You may also have male perspectives as well, but I do feel like women, what I see, are much more overly sexualized than men. And so for women, my thought is that some of the women that you're dealing with are already dealing with feelings of inadequacy, lack of self-confidence, because it is something that is like hugely happening amongst women that nobody really has the answer to other than self-care. And but it's like it's so hard to feel comfortable in your body when everything that's thrown at you is overly sexualized, and the idea of this perfect woman is something that is genuinely not what the average female body even can do or look like. Does that make sense?
Right. 100%. I agree 100% that
Mm-hmm.
we live in a culture that like everything is sexualized.
Mm-hmm.
And that's so often the effect that I see it having on the women that I work with, is that they almost always feel like it's them. They're not enough. My husband's looking at that stuff because I'm not pretty enough. I'm not thin enough. I'm not, fill in the blank enough.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so devastating for them to find out that there's this struggle. And that's one of the bigger challenges, is helping them work through the effect that it has so that they can feel whole again. Because
Mm-hmm.
the reality is that when somebody struggles with a pornography addiction, let's say, I've never, literally not once, I've never worked with a husband who's told me, whether it's in front of his wife or by, on a one-on-one session, I've never worked with somebody who said, it's because my wife isn't attractive.
Mm.
I turned to this because, it's like, she's not enough for me. I've literally never heard that. It's important for people to understand the reason why people struggle. If there is addiction or a habit that they're not able to break, addiction is a way to cope with pain. It's a negative way of coping.
Mm-hmm.
And some people cope with alcohol or drugs or food or Facebook. Like, there's hundreds of ways that we can just kind of zone out and numb out how we feel.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that pornography is one of the ways that a lot of people choose, because it's for multiple reasons. Usually people are exposed to it when they're young. The average age of exposure is between 9 and 11 years old.
Holy crap.
Yeah,
That's insane. Oh
I
my
know.
gosh.
I know.
My daughter's going to be 8 next year. That's insane.
Yeah, it's
Ah,
crazy. And,
okay.
people have access to smartphones, and on the bus at school, kids at school, like, it's not a matter of if they'll be exposed, it's when, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess maybe another part of what we can talk about is how parents can help protect their kids. But in terms of the effect that it has in a relationship, it's important to realize that it's not because the woman is inadequate. It's, again, in my experience, every single time it's been a way for the husband to cope. And he's exposed when he was very, very young. And that just became an outlet for him, or a way for him to cope from this internal, whether it's neglect or abandonment or fear or his own insecurities.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think it's really important for women to know. And in the beginning, almost every woman that I've worked with has felt like it was them. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
enough. This is my deficiency. But once they understand more about addiction and why people turn to it,
Mm-hmm.
they realize that it really has nothing to do with them. They don't have to try to compare themselves with what he's watching in order to keep his attention,
Mm-hmm.
which is, again, what many women think. It's understanding that that's his own struggle that he's dealing with, that he needs to learn how to, number one, resolve the reason why he's turning to it. And number two, find different ways of coping with what's happening in a way that doesn't affect her so deeply.
Mm-hmm. So could you run us through a scenario like that? Like in your podcast, you have some great examples of clients that it ends up that you start to uncover the layers, right? You uncover the layers of, okay, this is how the wife feels, but then the husband thinks that it's because he's bored, but then you start asking the questions. So could you run us through a scenario to get to a point of an example at the very bottom when you uncover all of it, that was like this moment that happened that now is his trigger point?
Sure. So I think many people don't understand really what their triggers are. If they struggle with a habit or an addiction, let's say, most people do say some higher level feeling like I'm bored or I'm stressed. I remember working with somebody just recently where he said his trigger is stress, and whenever I hear that, I know that that's like such a generic term that we want to uncover more of what that actually means. And so I'll spend time asking questions about, okay, well, what do you mean stress? Like, okay, I'll give you an example. So this particular person, he says, well, I get stressed at work, and while I'm at work, like I get stressed, I get overwhelmed. So then I flip on the computer and I turn to this thing, and then there's this like a momentary escape from how stressed I feel. And then I go back to doing my job. And if I'll ask questions about, okay, well, what specifically are you stressed about? Like, what are you noticing? What kind of things are you telling yourself? What's your self-talk? He gave an example of being in a boardroom with the other, sales members that were there, and they were showing each other their numbers. And when it got to be his turn, he knew that he ranked less than these other team members that were there. So in the moment that he felt this, he just kind of identified this as stress. But if I asked him, well, what did it feel like for you? What was going on the inside for you when you were up there presenting your numbers and they were less than everybody else's? He starts to talk about how small he feels, and he feels like he's doing a bad job and he's failing. And he's like, he feels embarrassment that he's not doing a good enough job as the other people that are in the office there. And so it goes from a very high level way of describing it, which is stress, to a very specific feeling of like failure or inadequacy. Because stress that sounds like a cop out, especially if a wife were to hear, oh, well, sorry, honey, like I'm stressed out, so I use this. That's so like, that does not.
Well,
Number one.
my
Yeah, go
first
ahead.
reaction as a wife or a woman would be like, you think you're stressed? Like,
Yeah, exactly.
try
Right.
doing my job. Like, we're all stressed, bud.
That's right.
We're all stressed, and we're all not like, that would be my first, which is not healthy, I know, but that would
It's
be my
true, though.
first initial thing. Like, stress, really? Like, you don't have anything deeper to give me other than just a blanket statement of stress. That would be my response.
That's exactly right. No, and that's what the wife did initially when he's trying to like fumble through describing why he's struggling. She gets super angry with him.
Right.
And I would too. I would feel the same way. I would react in the same way.
Yeah.
But through the work that we do, he's able to identify it. No, it's much, much deeper than stress. It's a fear of failure. It's my own sense of like unworthiness. I feel like I'm not good enough. Those deeper level things are what people are coping with. It's not just the stress of a work day, right? That's life. Life is stressful. And when people struggle with this, there's always a reason why. And most of the time it's some underlying negative belief about themselves, like not being enough or not being worthy, wanting validation because they don't feel like they're enough, like some underlying concern like that. So that once you identify that, then you can actually treat it. Then you can resolve it. If somebody doesn't feel good about themselves, then there's ways to help build their self-esteem so that they don't then need to cope with something that's not there anymore. So again, it has nothing to do with the wife, but it's something that's happening inside of him.
Right. So basically I'm just going to put this like very generic layman's terms. He feels bad. He wants to feel good. It's like basic addiction 101, but we kind of forget that pornography's addiction, the benefits that you get from it are literally the same benefits that you get from cocaine, drugs, alcohol. It's the same thing with a different face. So
that's exactly
somebody feels bad, they want to feel good. And that's like that dopamine hit, like all of those feel good chemicals that your body is filled with.
That's exactly right. And it literally activates the same part of the brain, the same neural pathways. It's the reward center, it's the pleasure center, the dopamine, like all of that is released to change somebody's state. Like you said, at the highest level, I feel bad, I want to feel good. And because so often people are exposed at such a young age and their bodies are not, like an 11-year-old is not equipped to process what they're watching. So it fills them with all sorts of emotion and chemicals. that then, the curiosity is there too, which is natural. We're naturally curious. And especially when we're young, we don't know any better. We don't know anything. So we're curious.
Mm-hmm.
So people go back to it, and then they start to feel something about it.
Mm-hmm.
So then it develops into something. If, if the circumstances, if there's this like perfect storm of things that are there. And so,
Mm-hmm.
yes, it's a state change ultimately.
Mm-hmm.
Not everybody chooses that. Again, people have a way to change how they feel, but this is one that feels so much more personal.
Mm-hmm.
If a husband were struggling with alcohol, the wife would hardly ever say, well, maybe it's because I'm not good enough. Like it wouldn't even
Mm-hmm.
cross her mind.
Mm-hmm.
But that's exactly what's happening though, when he's
Mm-hmm.
turning to pornography or getting attention from, some other female. It's so often a way to cope. It's their own insecurities and inadequacies that drive that. And that's not to justify it, right? Even as I hear
Mm-hmm.
myself saying this, I can hear a wife say, well, you're just kind of minimizing or justifying it. It explains it so you can then deal with it. But
Right.
it's not okay, right? Regardless of the
Right.
reason why, it's still not okay. We need to address it.
Yeah. So let's go there. Okay. What becomes okay and acceptable, and what isn't okay and acceptable? Like,
Yeah, that's a good question. And what's so tough, because I
yeah.
think sometimes people will wonder that, is that it's not the same for everybody.
Yeah.
And if it's because if you talk to some people, the wife will say, I don't care what he watches. I just don't want him to touch anybody. Like, let's say that's her line, her boundary. Other
Mm-hmm.
people say, I don't want him to watch anything. I don't want, like, zero pornography in our home.
Mm-hmm.
And the key is to know, how do you meaning, how does each person feel about it? And neither is right or wrong. And
Mm-hmm.
you're not gonna, like, if the wife says, I'm not comfortable with any degree of pornography in our relationship, and the husband says, it's not that big of a deal, everybody does this, why are you being so like, he can get really critical with her.
Mm-hmm.
We don't want her then to say, well, okay, fine, I guess that it's okay then, because so and so does it and she doesn't, her husband doesn't care.
Mm-hmm.
That never works. It never
Mm-hmm.
works, because if she doesn't feel comfortable with it, then it's a problem. And so we want to deal with it in each relationship and set up these, I don't know if we want to use the word boundaries, but like, set up these boundaries, for the lack of a better word right now,
Mm-hmm.
so she can feel comfortable in the relationship. Because if he wants a relationship with her, and that's this non-negotiable, then that just needs to be, then he gets to choose, okay, do I want to stay in a relationship and be happy with my wife, or do I just get rid of this stuff that I'm watching?
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's case by case, and it's okay for a woman to feel however she does,
Mm-hmm.
even if she gets different messages from her husband or society.
Mm-hmm. So it's, as a therapist, would you say, okay, I'm going to just run a scenario by you. Okay.
Okay.
Well, kind of a scenario. Like, I have interviewed a marriage and sex therapist, Jennifer Wiesner, who in the podcast said she would not eliminate porn as a tool. I think she considered it like a tool for within her practice for couples in marriage. So here I am over here, like civilian, for lack of a better term. I don't know where to go from here, so I have one therapist saying it's a tool, it's an educational tool, and I use it in my practice. And then you hear other therapists, and you dealing with this all the time are, probably feel differently. And I know that there's other specific therapists out there that say, no, like, porn should not be a factor in your marriage. What do I do now? Like, where do I go from here? It's so confusing.
It really is. And that's the thing, like, even in my own field, there's such a division.
Mm-hmm.
There's a camp that says it is good. It's a way to help couples grow their intimacy, and they see these benefits in it. But then there's this other camp that says it's like so harmful and it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't help. And if you want to grow your intimacy or develop a passionate relationship, there are other resources that you can turn to that
Mm-hmm.
aren't pornography,
Mm-hmm.
because of the effects that so many women and men both, right? It really does affect both people. And so the camp, like, there's two camps that are so divided. So I guess to answer your question, I think it really does depend on how the individual feels. If they feel uncomfortable about it, then the goal isn't to then make them comfortable about it unless they want to be. I guess this is what's tricky because I have my own personal beliefs on this. I think pornography is harmful. I've worked with enough people. I've seen the effect that it has. I can see as I it's not an interview, but as I work with men, they'll tell me how much it distorts their view of women. They see women as objects because that's what they're exposing themselves to. So you can't not be influenced by the content that you're consuming.
Right.
And so if a man is watching this scene, and again, there's research that talks about how much like the majority of pornography that's out there on the internet now is violent. There's some element of violence in it. So you can't not be influenced by what you're watching. And so I personally think that pornography is harmful. I don't think it has a place. I don't think it's the effects, the benefit that some people say. I think the cost outweighs the benefit. There are other ways to get the benefits that they're seeking. So, but however, that all being said, when I work with people, I don't superimpose what I think onto their situation. So if they come in and say, yes, this is a part of our relationship and it's not a problem, then I just say, okay, cool. Like, what are you here for then? Oh, we're struggling with communication. Okay, let's talk about that. And then we kind of, break all that down. So if somebody comes in and says, this is a problem, or if even one person says, this is a problem, I don't want my husband viewing this, then we have to work with that. I don't want to call it a constraint, but that like that element being in place, because it's not a constraint, but like we have to work with that element now.
Right.
If you want to develop a happy relationship, if that's something that affects her, then why would we try to make her comfortable with it again, unless she wants that as the goal?
Right. Right. So I guess that's an interesting question or an interesting thought. So if the wife feels like it's being viewed, what's the word I'm looking for? Responsibly, I guess. I don't know if there's a great way to do that, but say they're saying like, okay, well, I don't feel like it's affecting the marriage. I still feel like loved by my husband, but it does bother me. And I want to unwrap that. And I want to be okay with it. Is that something that you've ever done? I don't know what I'm trying to ask because it almost feels inappropriate asking. Is there women that want to be okay with this, that feel like maybe their past traumas make them feel like it's not acceptable and they don't want to feel that way anymore?
It's a great question.
Yeah.
I personally have not worked with that before because when
Okay.
people reach out to me, it's because they're struggling. It's because it's affecting them. They take it. They literally feel like it's cheating, right?
Right.
There's another like division, right? Is porn cheating or not? Well, for a lot of women, it feels like it is. So I'm not going to, come out with some decree and statement to say it is or isn't. It's just, how does it affect somebody? And then let's just work with that. And so if the woman says, I'm affected by this and I don't want my husband to be viewing this, and if she does have history of trauma in her life individually, and her husband's porn use is shining a light on that, I've never heard her say like, if I can resolve this trauma, then I'll be okay with him doing this. It's usually like, this just feels inappropriate. I don't want like really ultimately what it comes down to is that's such an important and special part of a relationship that most people don't want to have that shared, even if it's with people that you don't know on a screen.
And not physical. But it's still an act of betrayal. It still feels like betrayal. Yeah,
absolutely. And because that's such an important part of a relationship, that's, again, for most couples, they want it to stay within the relationship. A wife doesn't want her husband's attention to be on somebody else. She wants the attention to be within the relationship on her. And it's the same way for, when the roles are reversed, it all comes down to this idea of attachment. I use this word attachment. In other words, we long to be connected with our partner, and we are biologically hardwired to connect with our significant other people in our lives, our families, our close friends. And so when something or someone comes between that, it creates anxiety. It triggers these alarm bells in our brain because our brain perceives it as a threat.
Mm-hmm.
If something is going to take away attention and connection and love and acceptance and belonging, the brain, it activates the fear center in our brain,
Mm-hmm.
which is why there's so many negative feelings of betrayal and anxiety and depression, because we're wired to have that connection with somebody specific. So if their attention goes elsewhere, again, for many women, it biologically feels like a threat because of how much that relationship means to them.
Mm-hmm. Hey, sweet mama, I just wanted to remind you about an incredible opportunity to take these conversations one step further, to find like-minded women who want to dive deeper and pursue the things that they're interested in order to best raise our future generation. And that is with my Mama Mindset Tribe Facebook group. You can find the link in the show notes below. If you haven't already joined the group, I highly encourage you to do so. This is a free resource where you can ask questions, seek guidance, look for help, celebrate the wins of the mindset shifts that you've had, the 1% changes that you had in up-leveling your life, big things, little things, all of it. I want to celebrate all of it. I want to share all of it. We're going to ask some big questions and some participation opportunities. So if you haven't already done so, please head on over. The link is in the show notes below and join the Mama Mindset Tribe on Facebook. I look forward to having you join our tribe. I just imagine, just knowing women and knowing my listeners, we tend to suppress, shove it all down, push. It's not a problem. It's not a problem. It's not a problem. And then all of a sudden it's just this giant freaking explosion of shit that happens. And then it's just like out of control. So I have a two-part question in this. Like, what is the average age of your patients? Clients. Do you call them patients or clients? I'm sorry.
I call them clients. Yeah.
Clients. Okay. Clients. I want to make sure I use the right terms.
No,
so
that's fine.
like your average age of your clients. And then the other part of that I'm curious about is like, how long have they waited before they've addressed this? And I imagine by the time it gets addressed, you're dealing with like almost a full-blown explosion.
Yes. So yes, that's exactly right. I would say the average around in their 40s, late 40s, early 50s.
That's what I would have guessed. I just knowing women and how long we can suppress things.
Yes. And that's really what happens is for years, there's this cycle of it's discovered, they have a conversation, or it's not really a conversation, it's a fight, right? They have a big fight because of how much it hurts. And then the husband says, okay, you're right, I'm going to do better. And then he tries. But if it's gone so far that he's not able to quit on his own, or he's really, really struggling, he can do well for a little bit, but then it shows up again and he slips up and he goes back to it. And then she discovers it again. They have the same fight. Like that cycle happens many, many times, usually before they ultimately come in. And most of the time people are struggling with this for like between 10 and 20 years, which sounds like such a long time. And it is like, that's such a long time to have to do this cycle. But usually it takes just many, many fights. And it gets to the point where they say like, I can't do this anymore. Like this needs to be fixed or I can't stay. And a lot of times that will jumpstart the husband into saying like, okay, well, like, I'm going to call somebody. Because so often they think I'll just do this on my own. Like I can handle this. And if I just tried harder, if I had more discipline, but that's not where the shortcoming is. It's not a willpower, deficiency. Right. It's all this underneath stuff. And so ultimately the thing that often jump starts him into action is if the wife says like, I can't do this anymore. We have to fix this or it's too painful to stay stuck here. So it does take a long time. So
how do you determine if something is an addiction versus just a habit? Like what is the difference between that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I see it as a spectrum from ranging from like no use to use, abuse, dependence, addiction. So addiction is like super far out there. The way that it's described in the research, there's a few components to it. Number one, there's been multiple attempts to stop, but they've been unable to. There's an inordinate amount of time preoccupied with viewing or searching for it. It affects multiple areas of their life, whether it's relationships or self-esteem or spirituality, finances, work. But the main hallmark is that they've been unable to stop despite their best attempts.
Mm-hmm.
So that means it's just further down on that spectrum. And when that's the case, then it's important to get help. Like if you can't do it on your own, there's a lot of shame in this topic in particular when there doesn't, like, I wish there wasn't, because
Mm-hmm.
so many people struggle with lots of these types of issues, and you'd never know.
Right.
You'd never know that, your neighbor at church was struggling with this thing. But as I have kind of a backstage view of so many people that I work with, it's like, there are people that you would never guess that struggle with this.
Mm-hmm.
And it's everywhere. So you're definitely not alone. And if you need help, that's like great. Like there's resources available to get help.
Mm-hmm.
And usually that's, again, when people find themselves further down on that spectrum.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what's interesting, and I don't even know if I necessarily need to say this, but I'm just kind of thinking out loud here, is that like, this is something that is done it's the most intimate addiction, because you're doing this like totally in private. So there's not a lot of people that are going to even know about it, which
Right.
brings up almost this constant nagging thought: is he betraying me? Is he betraying me? Is he betraying me? Because you may never know, you may never be able to really know, versus, I'm just comparing this and thinking about like other types of addictions. Like, you're going to know if your husband, who's a recovering alcoholic, has relapsed. Like, you're going to
Right.
know that. You're going to smell it on his breath. You're going to find alcohol bottles. He's going to be coming home later at night. Like, there's aggressive behavior that may be happening, lethargic behavior. I mean, there's all of these like physical signs, external signs that are going on. But when you're talking about, addiction to pornography or even sex addiction, like, that's something that may not be visible.
Right. Which is tough, because I think, I was just thinking about some of the signs, or I think some of the signs can be, like, if there's isolation. Some people isolate more and more when they're involved in things that they're ashamed of. They're isolating, they detach, they're emotionally disconnected. There's like a lack of being present.
Mm.
There's secrecy. They'll hide their phone, they'll clear their internet browser history. Like, those are some of the things that can make people wonder, like, why is my husband acting like this?
Mm-hmm.
And those can be some of the signs. But like you said, there isn't like this physical display of that,
Mm-hmm.
as like you could smell it on somebody's breath, or like their speech is slurred. There is none of that. But
Mm-hmm.
those are some of the signs that people can say, like, well, something is off. Most of the women that I work with, before they discover, they'll just say, like, something is off and I don't know what it is. I can just feel it.
Mm-hmm.
I can feel there's this disconnect. He's not fully engaged. He's not present. I don't know what it is, but something is not right. And
Mm-hmm.
then eventually they'll find it. Most of the time, it's because, it's like, when this comes out, it's because the wife finds it.
Mm.
A husband very rarely volunteers it, because, number one, he doesn't want to hurt his wife. Number two, he feels embarrassed and shame about it.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's usually found. And then, like, that can get people having these conversations together once there is this, like, once the information comes out.
Mm-hmm. So I'm just sitting here thinking, like, if I were to be listening to this podcast right now, in fact, like, I'll just be really honest and vulnerable. Probably one of the first things that I'm going to do after this is go talk to Brad. Right. And just
Sure, sure.
like, how are we doing with all of this? And I already had kind of told him, like, me listening to your podcast brought up some questions that I have and I was, just being really honest with him and open, like, I want to have a conversation with you. And he's like, sweet, let's do it. But if I were a mom or a wife, a woman, a female listening to this, and I'm going to be like, okay, I really want to talk to my husband. How do we approach that conversation in an open way? How do I want to word that? Yeah. And I know that we kind of already talked about that. We kind of addressed it, but it just kind of triggered it in a different way to me, because they're going to go right from here and they're going to be like, how are you doing? What's going on? Is everything okay for you, without being like accusatory, I guess. I don't know. Can we
Sure,
dive into that just a
sure.
little bit
Yeah.
more? Because I can just sense, because if I'm sensing that and feeling that I want to like get off this podcast recording and then go talk to Brad about this, like, how do they approach that without like diving in feet first?
Yeah, I think you can even use the podcast as a conversation starter. Hey, I was just listening to
Mm-hmm.
this podcast. They had this guest on there that talked about, his experience working with people who have been struggling with pornography and the effects that it has in a relationship. I was wondering, like, what are your thoughts on it?
Mm-hmm.
Is pornography an issue for you? Is this something that you viewed in the past? I know it's everywhere, like it's everywhere, so you can't hide from it. But
Mm-hmm.
like, what are your thoughts or feelings on pornography? Is this something that's important to you, or is this something that's
Mm-hmm.
that that is this something that you find yourself doing? So I
Mm-hmm.
think you can use the podcast as a way to say, like, it's almost like if it comes out of nowhere, then it might feel strange, right? It's like, well, how do I even introduce that? So I think using these conversation starters can be a way into it. Hey, I listened to
Mm-hmm.
this thing. I wanted to get your thoughts on this.
Mm-hmm.
Is this something that you've participated in? And if so, like,
Love that.
what's, you know, like, I want to have a conversation about that.
Yeah. And then the person isn't asking, where is this coming from? And then they're wondering, like, did you see something on my phone? Or did you catch me?
Right.
Or did you talk to somebody? Or, it's
Yes.
like, oh, like this actually was something she listened to. And it just kind of sparked some curiosity within her. So she's not coming at me because I got caught.
Right.
So it's actually a little bit more of a safe space. So it's actually a really good time to use this conversation that we're having here as sort of a launching point for a very open, soft dialogue.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
Okay. I love that
does that
suggestion.
help? Okay.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
the other thought that I had is,
I mean, essentially, that's what I'm going to do. Like, that's exactly what I'm going to do is gonna be like, hey, I'm listening to this podcast that Sam has. And then we had this really intimate conversation about this. Now I have some questions. I'd love to just like hear your thoughts on this. And, I mean, that's exactly what I'm going to do. And what
yeah,
he's
I think it's
already
great.
like prepared. So I mean, I guess ours is a little bit different because I'm not like
Sure.
totally coming at him out of the blue. But anyways, yeah,
No, yeah, I think you can use that as
great.
a jumping off point.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
usually the thing that bothers women the most and hurts them the most isn't actually the behavior, it's the
Mm-hmm.
lying that goes with it. It's
Mm.
the secrecy and deception, like that breach of trust in that way. I've heard it, I don't know how many times now, where they'll still say, like, I'm uncomfortable with this, like I don't want him to view this. But the
Mm-hmm.
thing that's, if our relationship is not going to survive, it's not because he's viewing this, it's because he's lying and hiding it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think if you open up the door for a conversation to just understand, and you guys each have a chance to share your experience and your thoughts and your perspective on it,
Mm-hmm.
then it can feel like there's space to talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's uncomfortable for you, you can say, hey, this is something that, I do feel uncomfortable about this. Is this
Mm-hmm.
something you'd be willing to not do anymore for XYZ reason? Because I want your attention to be with me. And if you feel like you need pornography, I want to understand what you feel like the thing, like what drives that for you. Because a lot of people won't be addicted to it. But if it's like, there's a statistic that in the Journal of Marital and Sex Therapy, it said that over the last week, 80% of men in the survey that they did had said that they had viewed pornography in the last week.
Oh my
25%
gosh.
women, right? So it's like there's
Mm-hmm.
so many people that do it. That's not I'm not saying that 80% of men are addicted to it, right? It's like, okay,
Right.
if 80% of men admit to viewing it, there's reasons why they're viewing it. And if the wife feels hurt or uncomfortable about that, that's completely understandable.
Mm-hmm.
But the more they can have a conversation about understanding why he turns to it and what's the significance of it and what is he searching for and what's the purpose of it, you'll then be able to come together and figure out, how do you want to make this arrangement in your marriage? Like,
Mm-hmm.
what do you want it to look like? You won't be able to come up with a solution if the conversation gets shut down in the very, very beginning. And
Mm-hmm.
there's now this like fear of, okay, I can't talk about this. And if she finds this, then I'm going to be in big trouble. So I have to hide it. We want to try to just create that openness, which I know is like, it's easier said than done because it is so personal, but that's
Mm-hmm.
like ideal. That's the best case scenario, is if you can have those open conversations so that you avoid the minimizing, the lying, as best as you can.
Mm-hmm. I love that a
And
lot.
And
Yeah.
that being said, again, as I hear myself speak, sometimes, as a quick sidebar, it's tough to do a podcast because there's so many variables, right? There's so
Yeah.
many things that somebody could hear and like, well, how could he say that? Or how could they? So I try to think through, how are people hearing this?
Yes.
So the thought that I had just when I said that was, I don't want a woman to ever say to herself, he's not telling me the truth because it's my, like, I'm doing this wrong, this is my fault. That's
Right.
not it. Like, it's, if he's viewing pornography or if he's lying about it and he's hiding it, it's never her fault.
Okay.
It's always his choice.
Mm-hmm.
And we still want to find a way for them to come together in the most effective way possible to be able to then create solutions. So I don't want
Mm-hmm.
people to walk away feeling like, well, maybe this is my fault on some level because I didn't respond well when I found it on his phone that one time. Like, it's understandable and normal for you to react. Now we can always go back and try to have more conversations to create that opening. So I guess I
Mm-hmm.
want to at least say that.
Yeah, no, I'm really glad you included that in there too, because I'm kind of the same. I'm like, okay, well, what about this scenario or what about that scenario? And that
Yeah.
is what is really tough about the podcast is we're like limited on time, and this isn't a full therapy session, so we're not,
Right.
unpacking each individual like situation. So I do want to share kind of a thought that I had when I was kind of talking to Brad about this before, just kind of preparing for this interview. Honestly, I talked to him about a lot of this stuff, and
Yeah,
before
that's
I
great.
get ready for these conversations, just roundtable discussion kind of thing. And um I think as kids, him and I both came from very conservative families, very conservative families. And I know that this is common. So I'm just speaking like very generally from like just my friends that I know and kind of within our social circle and things like that. I think there's so much shame around sex when you're young. It's just absolutely shamed. And then you get into college or you get into an adult as an adult and you're able to get out of the house. And, so whatever you are exploring as a child or a young adult is in secret.
Yep.
And so then there's like almost that rush of secrecy. And then you get into college and you have ultimate freedom and you have access to everything and you can do whatever the hell you want. And then you
Yep.
make really bad choices, but you're like, it's okay because everybody else is doing all of these really bad choices. Insert whatever. I mean,
Yep.
insert sex, insert drugs, insert
Yep.
alcohol, insert pornography, whatever. Like, I'm just, I'm speaking like on sex and pornography in general, but you could literally insert any kind of behavior. So you're thrown into adulthood, you're out on your own. And so it's like shamed, then it's accepted because it's common, it's everywhere. And then you get into like marriage and your later adult years, and now you're like, this isn't healthy, and now I don't know what to do about it. But I do think that it is sort of stemmed and and triggered exponentially because of the shame that is surrounding sex and sexuality as you're maturing. And then it becomes this like forbidden fruit, essentially. And then
Mm-hmm.
nobody teaches you like how to appropriately use this forbidden fruit. And then it becomes a problem. When do you think, I don't necessarily even have like, that's not even really a question. It's just more like an insight or thought that I had
Sure.
on it. But my question, I guess, in regards to that would be, when do you think this starts to become a problem for people? Like, at what age?
It's a great question. And that's exactly what happens for so many people. As I think about my own experience, the birds and the bees, quote unquote, talk
Mm-hmm.
when we're young, like, I didn't get one of those, like
Right.
literally nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And so anything that I learned about it was from like other kids, like in middle school or high school, which they don't know anything, right? It's like the stuff
Mm-hmm.
that they've seen or heard. And so one of the most important things for parents to do is have these discussions. I remember hearing somebody say, gone are the days when we can do the big T talk, like the one and like, okay, we're never going to talk about this again. There's the one time and that was it.
Mm-hmm.
He said that you can't do that anymore. It has to be lots and lots of little T talks that feel much more informal and feel there's like no pressure around this. It's like, notice, hey, like you can have conversations throughout the day or throughout the weeks of just what's going on and what are you noticing. And I think having conversations is so important for the reason that you just described, that if you don't, now there's all this secrecy and I did this thing, and intuitively kids like feel this fear if they stumble upon this. Like on some level they know that this isn't good, or
Mm-hmm.
like they'll get in trouble, or like there's some negative energy there. And so I
Mm-hmm.
think kids, like I said, it's like an early age of exposure that oftentimes that begins this like process of they're exposed to this. And I think even more so now, right? It's hard to not be exposed to it.
Mm-hmm.
But without having those conversations, now there's so much secrecy around it. So if parents can introduce this topic to them, and one of the best resources that I could ever recommend somebody to get, it's a book called, this is for parents. It's a
Mm-hmm.
book called Good Pictures, Bad Pictures. I can't
Mm.
remember the name of the author.
Okay.
You'll find it on Amazon. It's like the first thing that'll show up. But it's a book that this author created to help parents have age appropriate conversations with their kids as early as like 5.
Mm.
And so we have the book. Our oldest daughter, 6. So like a year or 2 years ago, we introduced this topic to her in an age appropriate way to prepare her for the inevitable day when a friend says, hey, look, check this out. Or some boy on the bus, or like somehow she's going to stumble upon it. But
Mm-hmm.
we're teaching her what to do, and we're talking about it in a way that there is no shame, there
Mm-hmm.
is no judgment. It's like, hey, if this happens, this is what you do. Come and tell mom and dad, and we'll figure this out. And the book gives some super good strategies and conversation starters, because I think that's the problem for most parents. They have no idea what to say.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so much fear that if they do bring it up, it's going to create curiosity in their kid, and then they're going to be going out and searching for it because the parent brought it up. But the reality is it's the opposite. If you take away the secrecy and the shroud of this, like, the mysticism, if you take all that away and like, this is normal. Like we talk about this, and curiosity is normal. And we want to understand our bodies. And when the time comes, talk about sex in through the years, right? It's multiple conversations.
Right.
But that book is like gold to help parents have those talks, which can eliminate a lot of the problems that go along with not having those discussions.
Mm-hmm. I'll definitely put that in the show notes for everybody to find that. That's really good. That's really, really good information. So going back to that a little bit, then what age do you think it starts to become a problem? Like, in what age do you think it starts to become like a problem, I guess, amongst men? Like as I was kind of giving that like full circle, like shame and then acceptance because it's just normal because everybody's doing this and you're in college or you're an adult or whatever, young adult, and it seems like everybody's partaking in whatever explorative activity we can find
Sure,
when you
yeah.
go to college. I don't know. Maybe that was just my crazy social group of friends. I don't know. Like so many bad choices. We will not go there on this podcast episode. But then where do you go from there? So at what age does it then become like, do you see it becoming a problem? I mean, you have people coming in at, like you said, like mid 40s where they're finally seeking help, but at what age has it now become a problem?
Yeah, I think for many people in their teens,
Oh yeah.
because they're
Okay.
exposed to it and they don't have the capacity or the mental wherewithal to understand what they're seeing. We're not like, kids are not designed to be watching what's available nowadays. In the past, it was just these pictures, right? And I say when I say just, not to minimize them, but comparatively, very, very different. And so kids don't have the capacity to process what they're watching. And so I think it becomes an issue. Like it's almost like your family determines how, like, heavily influences how you view sex by how they talk about it or don't talk about it. Okay. So if parents don't talk about it, now it's this thing, like it's this mysterious, like taboo topic. Now there's this like energy around that. But if parents, like, that's just another thing that they talk about. And again, you can do it in an appropriate way. You don't have to be vulgar or crass or anything. But if it's just another topic of conversation, that subconsciously sends a message like, this is okay to talk about. This is something that's important. This is something that I can have questions about. These are things that I can, like, it changes how people experience. So I think in their teen years, many kids, if they don't have this foundation, and if they don't have anybody to talk to, now it gets the ball rolling in terms of like how they feel and perceive it and how like the messages around it. So I think, yeah, for many people in their teenage years, early, that's oftentimes the beginning of the problem.
Okay. I'm going to interject a little bit in here because if people are at this point thinking like, well, I don't know even how to start bringing up this conversation. We're going to really try and stay on topic today with what we're talking about, even though I feel like you'd be a wealth of knowledge on how to bring this conversation up. But I did interview Jennifer Wiesner. So I'm just going to put a quick plug in here that if people want some tips, tools, or resources on additional tips, tools, and resources on how to bring this up, they can go back to my previous episodes. I don't have the episode number off the top of my head right now, but you can see in the description, it has Jennifer Wiesner's name. There's 2 parts of how and when to address this topic with your kids. So I just wanted to insert that because we're not going to get into that in this episode today. But she does give some other good tools and resources. Sounds like you guys are very similarly on the same page with that topic as well. She's a huge advocate. It's all about how to bring it up with your kids. So
That's great. Yeah, that's great.
Okay. So what other tips and tools and resources do you have? I don't want to wrap this up, but I feel like we have to end this at some point, so I don't keep taking up your time. But you have so much information, and I really appreciate this conversation, Sam. So, is there anything that I guess I should say in addition to the tools and resources? Is there anything that we didn't address today that you really feel like you want to share?
I mean, I think the thing that is most important is that people know that they're not alone. If they're struggling, I can't tell you how many people who I initially start working with who say like, I feel like completely alone. I can't tell my family. I don't want to talk to his family. I don't want to talk to my friends. I don't want him to look bad, or, whatever the rationale is, they keep it to themselves. Like you said earlier, they suppress, and they feel so isolated in this. So for women to understand that there absolutely is help, that so many people are struggling with how to grapple with this and the effect that it has and the betrayal that it creates and the uncertainty in the relationship. And what does this mean? Like, there's so much that people have to like deal with when they're uncovering or understanding that somebody that's close to them is struggling with this. So I think the first thing is just like, you're not alone if that's you. And number 2, there are resources to help not only your husband, but to help you too, because most women don't get the attention and the support that they need. The way that most people think about it is, well, my husband's struggling, he needs to go to get therapy, and I'm going to wait till he gets this thing figured out. All the while they're struggling with their own like hurts and pains and betrayal and loss of trust. So just knowing that you're not alone, there are resources out there to help you at any stage of this process, whether you just found out yesterday or you've been doing this for 20 years, like there absolutely is help. It's just getting the right tools and resources and direction to help resolve that. So I at least wanted to maybe end with that message of hope that people come through this. This is not something that, it's not a life sentence. Even if somebody's struggling with an addiction or is further along on that spectrum, people can overcome addictions. And then they're not, I don't like to use the word addict because I feel like that's like this definitive identity statement. When once you break these patterns and you start to see things and think about things differently, like you're not addicted anymore once you get away from it. So it's absolutely possible to heal. So I want to at least share a message of hope that you're not alone and you can do it.
I love that. Thank you so much for adding that in there, because I think that would be a very common feeling that almost everybody would have. I think it would be something that a lot of people would struggle with. So thank you for adding
you're welcome.
that in there. So how can people find you if they have additional questions? Or I know you have a course available for people. Is that on your website? Can you share about that a little bit?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Yeah. So you can find just a bunch of resources. There's a bunch of free resources on the website, coupleshealing.org. So my podcast is there. I have a free mini course for couples. I have some support for the husbands as well. And so, you can find out any more information there and start to listen along and get some tools that way too.
Your podcast is incredible. I mean,
thank you.
It's very, very, you have a very comforting voice. So it's very approachable, and I think you do a really great job of giving some really great examples of clients that you have and how you kind of unwrap the trauma that's lying underneath that really helps us realize, coming full circle in this whole conversation, that really helps us realize it's not about the husband not being attracted to their wife. It's not about the wife at all in any way, shape, or form. Most of the time, and what it sounds like from you in every experience, it has nothing to do with them not being attracted to them or not wanting them. So you
Right.
do a really, really great job in the podcast of giving some great examples and unwrapping a lot of that. So it's a great
Thank you.
resource. So I highly encourage people to go check that out and listen, check out your website. And I'll put all of your contact information in the show notes so people can find you really easily. And thank you.
Great.
This
Thank
was
you.
so enlightening. This was so eye-opening and approachable. You did a great job. You do a great job of making this a very approachable conversation to have, which is essentially, I mean, that's like super challenging. I don't know how you do it because
I know.
it's a really nerve-wracking conversation to have. And it just seems like so approachable how you go about it. So thank you for bringing that to
Thank
the
you.
audience.
No, I really appreciate it. It's been a pleasure to be here. Again, I love the mission that you're on to help empower
Thank you.
women and mothers. And I think this is another way just to help support them and give them resources as you've had so many guests on to help give direction. So I really appreciate you having me on. It's been awesome. I appreciate
Yeah,
it.
absolutely. Thank you so much, Sam. We'll talk to you soon.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye. Hey, sweet mama. Thank you so much for joining Sam and I in this incredible conversational journey. Like I said in the beginning, I was a little bit nervous to have this conversation with him, and he is amazing. He is so amazing. So if you found value in this conversation, please share this today. This is one of those taboo topics that I feel like we need to spread. We need to get this out there. And I really want to make moms feel more confident and more comfortable in talking about this topic and approaching this topic with their husbands, with their spouses, because as Sam shared with us in this episode, it's a very, very common issue. And as moms who want to take proactive steps, as wives, as women who want to take proactive steps forward and action steps forward, the best way that we know how to do that is by gaining some knowledge and some insight. So, Sam, thank you so much for joining me today. Ladies, I hope you found as much value in this as I did. It was absolutely an incredible opportunity. And I'm so grateful that Sam came on and shared with us his vast knowledge and expertise in this conversation. So give us a like and a share today. As always, thank you so much for listening. I look forward to talking to you all again very soon.